Please, let's welcome Dr. Patrick Bryne.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Good morning. Good morning. A lovely conference. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Blockchain World Conference for putting on such a lovely show. I did a doctorate in philosophy, so you don't have to. And I'm telling you that because sometimes when I talk about blockchain, those of you who have seen me before, I see this as a big philosophical moment in history. I see that the blockchain has real political implications. And I'd like to talk about that. So I did not do my normal heavy slideshow. I've been criticized for doing these 50 slides in a presentation. I didn't do that. Instead, I'd like to talk philosophy, and so it didn't look like a college lecture. I'd like to talk about philosophy because I want to show you the real historical importance of what's going on here. People are coming into this like it's another business, another thing like the internet or something. No, this has a real historical importance that I think is going to go beyond the internet. In the Torah, and don't ask me what a guy named Patrick Michael Xavier O'Byrne knows about the Torah, but in Sefer Dvarim, or what an altar boy like me would call the Book of Deuteronomy, there's an odd line. It says that moving the boundary stones between two men's property is a sin. You know, you could, like if we're marking the boundary between our property with stones, that adjusting those, me stealing a little bit of land by moving one of those markers, that's a sin worse than murder. I remember being a kid when I read that, wondering why, and the first time I got to meet a rabbi, I got to ask him why. And he told me, well, think of it from the point of view of, from our point of view, we out in the wilderness. If you've come out to of course they saw as the wilderness, and you're settling it, if there's one among us who's doing things like that, it is corrosive to the whole project of civilization. It's corrosive, and that's why it's a sin worse than murder. It's not an offense of just one person, and it's offense against civilization as a whole. The Romans had similar concepts. They saw something that we're quite used to, and we see, as just part of our normal life, something they did that the Romans distinguished. They realized that they figured out that there were some goods, like a hat. If I go to a hat check and I put a hat check in, my hat in, I get my claim ticket, and I come back later to put my ticket in, I expect my hat. I don't expect just any hat. I expect my hat. But there are other goods that don't have that property. And the Romans, they were the first to notice this stuff. That these fungible goods, like oil, that you could be storing casks of oil, olive oil, in somebody's warehouse, and you get, I put in 100 and I get 100 claim checks. When I come back someday with 100 claim checks, I really don't care about getting my oil. I care about getting just 100 casks of oil. And they understood that these two things were different, and people running the warehouses for the oil realized that they could actually, they might have 10 people each give 100 casks, so they hand out 1,000 tickets. They could really do other things with about 700 or 800 of those, sell them, loan them, etc. And as long as not everybody shows up at the same time on the same day, they could make the system work. But the Romans saw that. So basically fractional reserve banking. They did fractional reserve banking with commodities. The Romans saw that as a crime of expropriation. And it's very interesting. I've learned that it's something people either see in a minute or they never see. If I've given 1,000 different people claim checks on 1,000 casks of oil, but I'm really taking 2/3 of them out the back door and doing other things, am I doing something wrong or not? Arguably not, because if the system works and I still keep a reserve of 1/3 of them or so, and I can make it work so when everybody comes in, I'm never short of one barrel of oil or a cask of oil for one claim check, it can make it all work, so arguably I haven't cheated anyone. But the Romans and they saw that as a crime of expropriation. And I'd say the same thing goes for fractional reserve banking. There are some of us who just can never get our head around the idea that that's fair, that at the end, in the same way, there are some of us, like the Romans, who just couldn't get their head around the idea that that was a okay thing, even though if no particular person discovered they'd been defrauded. This goes on, interestingly enough, and I'll close this little history lesson on this point. So we give credit to there was a school in, anyone ever hear of Austrian economics? Austrian school economics? Oh, good. Well, Austrian school economics actually comes from a university in Spain called Salamanca, which 400 to 500 years ago, there was a group of priests, scholastics, and Jesuits who figured out a lot of interesting things. They saw that this influx of gold and silver from the New World created an explosion of prices, and so they saw the velocity of quantity theory of money. All kinds of things we give credit to later economists for seeing, these folks saw. The subjective theory of value and so forth. They revived this doctrine of fractional reserve banking being problematic because it had this latent expropriation in it. Interestingly enough, and I don't know if anyone's written about this, I mean, I've looked for it, and I can't find anyone who's noticed this. There's a doctrine buried in Islam that's very close to something that appears in this. Oh, by the way, this school in Salamanca, this university, the ideas floated to the east of the Spanish reign, and we sometimes forget there was a period where Europe was basically Spain, with one island of France floating in it, but other than that, it was basically Spain. And the ideas came out of Spain, and they floated to the eastern edge of the Spanish reign, and the eastern edge was the Österreich, or Austria, and they went there to the university system, and they went into hibernation for 250 years while Spain declined. Spain went into its great decline. All of the economics that had been discovered was forgotten. It starts reemerging in England. England had its great, industrial revolution and gets all this credit for what they discovered in economics, but actually they were in many ways like they were repeating stuff that had been discovered a few hundred years earlier. Anyway, these ideas stayed in hibernation in Austria for 250 years, and then they emerged 150 years ago as the Austrian school. That's what we know as the Austrian school, but it really comes from Spain. And what's interestingly, it emerged in Spain just 50 years after the Moors were driven out. And I'm actually going over there to try to research this, to find this out. Is there in the lifespan of one professor, this idea in Sharia finance and Islamic financing, there's a prohibition everybody knows about interest, but there's actually, you don't ever see it written about, but there's a prohibition on the second thing, and the second thing is called gharar. I don't speak Arabic, but it's a word that basically means expropriation. Anyway, the point is there's this long line in these different historical examples I'm talking about of understanding that fundamentally the project of civilization begins when you get clear boundaries. Good fences make good neighbors, good property relations, not fuzziness, not ambiguity. And where society, and it's it's counterproductive to tolerate that fuzziness in property relations creates opportunity for theft or expropriation that many people in our tradition, and I would say like the tradition of philosophical liberalism, have found problematic. So that brings us to blockchain. That's why blockchain is so historically important. I think that what we've learned is that these institutions that Western liberalism has built for hundreds of years, I guess the last little piece of history I'll give you. There was a great Federalist paper, Federalist Paper number 10. James Madison wrote this paper saying, We have the Federalist Papers were the essays to try to convince the American people to adopt this new Constitution. And there's one paper where they say we didn't get it right. We know, there's a beautiful, beautiful paragraph. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it says basically we studied all the previous attempts at democracy, both ancient and modern, and saw what made them fail, and we designed this Constitution to address those different failures. But there's one problem we didn't figure out how to solve, and unfortunately it's the problem that brings down democracy more than any other problem. Anyone know that problem? They called it factions, which is what we would call special interests, or regulatory capture. It all goes hand in hand. The idea that powerful, concentrated interests get a hold of and capture government or components of government. That's what they saw as the thing that they had not been able to figure out how to solve, and it's the problem that, looking back, brings down democracy more than any other. Well, I think what's happened in our country is that they were right. I think what's happened is that our Constitution worked pretty well up until about the 1930s. And then some big holes were punched in it. Somebody may have a different point of view, but some big holes were punched in it. And the limits on the institutional design of our nation got significantly changed. It's quite interesting how it got changed, where it came from. There was a socialist, a very hardcore lefty in Italy, very hardcore. It was actually the editor of the socialist newspaper or magazine of Italy. Very considered so hardcore, he was looked at as too hardcore. But anyway, he fought in World War I, and he came out with a slightly different, he became nationalistic, but he still had this very hardcore lefty approach called syndicalism to how to organize society. The only syndicalist I know of today is a guy named Noam Chomsky. But what this Italian guy had was a model of syndicalism, of how the state should run, where the state is this sort of great hall that takes competing interests, which are all unions and all kinds of different corporations and such, and they all argue out in the great hall of government, and government controls the conversation, and that's how they manage. So it isn't the old-fashioned central planning of Lenin. It was a different kind of socialism called syndicalism. This guy fights in World War I, comes out, still wants to organize society the same way. Now he's more militaristic than he was. But he was very widely well regarded on the left. His name was Benito Mussolini. People forget that where he came from. He was very well regarded on the left, and he was studied, particularly by Columbia University Economics Department. And when Franklin Roosevelt was elected, they had the same relationship with Roosevelt that Breitbart does today with our current president. And Roosevelt was taught this and very much consciously adopted Mussolini's program for Italy for the United States. And the institutional design of our society changed tremendously at that point. And there's the Supreme Court knocked it down. I'm not making this up. There was a guy named Hugo Johnson, a general who carried around, he was an explicit fascist. People would use the word then not as a term of abuse. He was Roosevelt appointed him as the head of the National Recovery Act, which was 3 years later declared unconstitutional. There were all these people in Roosevelt's cabinets who had these deep ties to the Mussolini administration, and the Supreme Court kept knocking it down, and then in September of 1936, Roosevelt said, if you do this anymore, I'm going to pack the court. And in 1937, the court came out and surrendered the Constitution, and a very different institutional design took over the United States. What's happened as a result of that is it became very profitable for us to go to Washington and fight with Washington basically to get them to write checks to us on the bank account of other people. And for about 40 years, that worked pretty well. And we all found we could organize into different pressure groups and go and get Washington to write checks on other people's accounts, but then we all learned how to organize to stop checks from being written on our accounts. And then by about 1980, we all found a group we could write checks on their account, checks on their bank account, and they could never organize to stop us. And that is, of course, what group of people can never organize to stop us from looting their bank account? The group of future human beings. And one way or another, what we did was we looted the future. And then, damn it, you youngsters showed up and you're here, and we've looted your bank accounts. This is all made possible, I think, because of, at the deepest level, property relationships that are fuzzy, that have ambiguity, that have opportunity for expropriation. For thousands of years, we've been trying to solve our problems of consensual exchange by coming up with third-party institutions that we trust. As we engage in third-party exchange, we can't, if we don't know each other and we can't trust each other, and I'm trading you a camel for your gold coin. I don't know if you debase the coin or not, so I can't trust you. So somebody has the opportunity to create a business model they have a mint. The guy who has monopoly on violence in the area creates a mint, puts his face on the gold coin, says anyone who debases that gets killed. That's a business model. It's a way of monetizing his monopoly on violence. And it creates it happens to be government, but that's the business model. There's 100 institutions of society that we've been creating for thousands of years now that have that basic feature. They are there so strangers can interact, and even though they don't trust each other, they each have to just trust that institution, that mint, that land titling office, that central bank, that voting system, whatever. Those institutions, those institutions, on the one hand, I've grown old and cynical. I'm quite cynical about those institutions. I think that Federalist number 10 was correct, that there's, at the end of the day, that's the real flaw of philosophical liberalism, of the Western tradition. If we try to create a world of laws and not men, well, what happens when the institutions that enforce the laws become unreliable? Well, blockchain has come along, and this is the great magic, is that we can now achieve at the genetic level what it is about. For the first time in thousands of years of history, we can have consensual exchange and have it be trustworthy without relying on those third-party institutions. That's the deep meaning of this. But the thing is, for 6,000 years, we've done it this other way. I've been out in a stealth company in Silicon Valley where there was a wall with 160 functions of society, and some of them government and some of them private, but looked at through this lens of what they really do is they're there just to provide trust, so strangers don't trust each other. We each just trust the Visa card company. We each just trust, and that you can now do with blockchain. And you can do it not only 80 or 90% cheaper, we think. I think it's going to end up being just the technology, and I'm looking at the kind of applications that, and I'll walk through in a minute what we're doing. But it looks like it's going to be much, much, much cheaper to do all kinds of things, settlement on Wall Street, land registration, et cetera, through blockchain than through the conventional system. But more importantly, it's going to become, we're going to live in a world where things are immutable and transparent, and it's going to make all kinds of corruption harder. It's going to make it harder to break the law for us and not have our money tracked or something. But it's also going to make it harder for government, and it's going to make it harder for corruption. And there's all kinds. We who live in the United States, which is basically a rule of law country, and where you can count on laws, at least unless they're egregiously violated, to be enforced, may forget what the rest of the world is like. And those of you who spend time in the developing world, just you live with corruption around you like living next to a waterfall or something. You don't even hear it anymore. It's just a factor of life. That's all going to, it's going to be possible anyway to bring that to an end. I'll tell you what I've just told you so far is stuff I figured out really about 4 years ago. And I decided that I wanted to get into the fundamental, if there's this new age coming to mankind riding on a blockchain, what are the processes I want to be involved in? And the most fundamental processes I could think of were, first of all, the creation of capital itself, money, capital markets, supply chain, and voting. Because one hopes that this new age is still an age where the consent of the governed matters and voting is going to matter. So those were the fundamental blocks I want to be involved with. Well, capital, where's that come from? I'm a subscriber to the views of a Peruvian economist named Hernando de Soto, who's quite a thinker, and he has argued that capitalism worked in the West and failed everywhere else because we got land titling right. And once you have land titling, you have a piece of paper you can take to a bank and borrow some money. But of 7.5 billion people on Earth, 5 billion of them don't live in that world. They live in favelas, where there's no formal piece of paper from a government. There may be some entry in somebody's book there, the tough guy in the neighborhood who keeps the book and keeps a track of whose shanty belongs to what house and to which family. And that's how they live. And you don't have any reason to improve your land because you never know if the local generalissimo is going to show up and say, Senor, you thought that was your grandfather's land, that was my grandfather's land. And you don't have any piece of paper you can take to a bank and borrow money. And so capitalism never really gets going and growth hasn't worked. But this economist pointed out, if you could just title up, do land titling in poor countries like Egypt, you would free up, like you could take all the aid that the West has ever sent the developing world, put it in a box and multiply it by 100. And that's how much capital would spring into existence around the world if we can get land titling right. So blockchain meets land titling. We have one company which is doing blockchain meets land titling, and through a combination of blockchain and mobile apps and social media and digital marketing, all of which Overstock is quite solid in, we think we can solve that problem. And in fact, I'm really planning on spending my next 5 years on it. Anyway, so that's the base layer. The next layer is you need money, and that means blockchain meets central banking. And we have one investment in the world's leading company, and I'm working on an investment in the other leading company in that space. Blockchain meets central banking. The IMF came out about 6 months ago and said every poor country in the world should do this immediately, digitize their fiat currency. By digitizing their fiat currency, for 40 years or so, economists have been talking about the problem of the unbanked, that 85% of the world doesn't have a bank account. You work cutting sugar cane in a field, you get $2, you put it in your sock, you go home, you're keeping a shoebox. People are not connected to the financial, to the world as we know it. Well, they really can be now through the magic of mobile phones and smartphones and biometrics and such. We can give them everything they would have without an underlying banking industry. That's what's so, well, the next layer, so once you have what those two layers I described, once you have a system where people can register land through their phone, that it's all done through blockchains that no corrupt government agent can do anything with. Imagine that you did that for the world, and then and you also have digitized fiat money. Maybe not for the world, just for one country. You've got the blockchain land titling, and you have the digitized fiat currency. You have peer-to-peer apps on people's phones just peer-to-peer apps where people, peer-to-peer lending. So 5 billion people can start sharing, saving capital, investing it with each other and such. Again, all without a banking industry as we know it. I remember about 1980 listening to some economics professor discourse on how many tens of millions of tons of copper it was going to take to wire up India. And of course, so that every village, every home in every village had a telephone. And of course, they never needed the tens of millions of tons of copper because the cell phone came along and they just leapfrogged that step. Well, similarly, we are very close to a world where developing countries can adopt these technologies and we have for 70 years been telling the developing world, you want to catch up, look at the institutions we built and now you build them. Look at our banking system and you build it. Then you get everybody to sign up for a bank account and so on and so forth. Well, with this technology I'm describing, they're going to be able to have capital and share capital and save capital and invest capital all without an underlying banking system, all through just these blockchain apps I'm describing. On top of all of that, there's one I'm particularly excited about is once you have capital and money to express it in, a capital market. To me, capital markets are like, I pray in the Holy Church of capital markets. I'm a big fan. Capital markets, capital markets, it's like where the oxygen in our lungs, where our lungs puts the oxygen in the bloodstream. I'm really sick about, I don't know what to think about our nation's capital markets. 10 years ago, I was a huge critic of them. I think they're better now, and I think the regulation is much better. But we can have a world, did you know that the regulators, oh, by the way, I don't have a clock up here, so I'm not, how 1 minute? 1 minute? Well, okay. So, well, with that, I'll stop on that note. Thank you very much. Keep over. I'm being told to keep going. No. How about, okay. Does any, why don't I take a question until we figure this out? Yes, sir. Do I have any thoughts on hedging cryptocurrency through the capital markets? Yeah, it's too thin now. There's certainly a business model. The last time I was looking at it a few years ago, I decided I didn't want to do it, but there's going to be a business model. The markets are just now, I suppose, thick enough that you can do it and make some money at it. But yes, sir. Is there an organizer in the back who wants to tell me when I'm out of time? Because I'm just going to talk. You're the organizer. Am I out of time? Oh, she has a question. Go ahead. The question is, what's a better investment, Overstock or T0? I can't imagine any way I can answer that without getting in some legal problems. So I just can't answer. Listen, it's so exciting. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, you talked about this stuff. You didn't get people like you at a conference. You didn't get folks like you. It's been really so gratifying, really, about the last 18 months, seeing this turn into a legitimate industry and not have to explain to people, no, this is not about, Silk Road and ecstasy dealing or something. I'll give you a hint. Okay, I'm gonna walk off on this note. It's you ought to look into something called Ravencoin, and it's an open source movement. It's still at 2 cents or something. I think I'm not pumping this as like a pump coin or something. It's a very interesting coin, and it's spreading quickly. Okay, thank you very much.